G'day, folks. Nate here from Tethix. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Matt. I come to you from Wurundjeri country. I'm in Brunswick East. And before getting into today's presentation, I'd like to quickly acknowledge country. In the embrace of Earth's timeless wisdom, we honour the sacred custodians of lands that stretch across Australia's vast horizons, and to the seas and communities that pulse with life. We extend a hand of respect to the wise elders who have walked before us and those who walk with us today among the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our acknowledgement necessarily weaves further to Indigenous communities globally whose lands cradle the veins of our interconnected digital world. We recognise the enduring echoes of the past and the ripples of the present that continue to shape the homes and hearts of these sacred peoples. Today's presentation is an extension, if you will, of something that Matt and I presented yesterday at Data 61's Symposium on diversity and inclusion in artificial intelligence. And we are going to talk about this big picture framing question, one of the many things that we are deeply interested in and have been attempting to practice for many years. Whether or not a culture that supports truly participatory ethics enhances diversity and inclusion in AI development. Before getting into the core of our work at Tethix, let's set the scene. There is a fairly significant body of literature now that suggests that organizations writ large and many teams working within these organizations have stated ethical intentions that fall within a fairly tight distribution. The example that you see on screen comes from the Responsible AI Maturity Index, and we think this highlights it well. Now, it does so relative to Australia's AI ethics principles. And what you see here from 436 individuals surveyed. And it's important to note that all of these folks are actually responsible for AI development within their organizations. Now, these 436 folks suggested that the organizations they work within or that they represent are actually operating in alignment to the following principles. Quick note before we move on, this may be obvious, but diversity and inclusion doesn't actually make an appearance here. From this same body of research, however, we also see that there's a fundamental lack of responsible AI maturity within these same organizations. We're not looking at different organizations here. We refer to this phenomenon as the ethical intent to action gap. This describes the space, it's typically pretty significant, between stated ethical intentions and real world behavior. And almost everywhere we look in an organizational or institutional context, we see that this gap is huge. It's like the Grand Canyon. And this was something that Donald Sull and colleagues highlighted in their 2020 work at one of MIT's media labs. They looked at the relationship between corporate value statements and culture. And they note in their conclusion that there doesn't even seem to be a statistical correlation between the two. Pop the dog over here. Although there's nuance and complexity that we can't possibly unpack in a short presentation, we might try and do a little bit of justice to that in our discussion. There are three consistent observations from our work that we believe are intimately implicated in this ethical intention to action gap. The first is that most AI ethics initiatives are driven by top-down mandates. They are exclusive rather than inclusive by design. Now, this limits the diversity of perspectives included in the actual process that gives rise to documented, but often fairly static value systems that then play out to varying degrees within an organizational context. The second is that these initiatives, as a result of being exclusive and top-down, are disconnected from the mental models the rituals, the processes, and the tools that make up everyday team and individual workflows. Ethics can sometimes feel like it's forced upon us. It's something that we have to do. And because we haven't been meaningfully included in the process itself, it lacks a meaningfulness. It's hard to operationalize, and it's not something that we necessarily live and breathe. And thirdly, before moving on, when push comes to shove, trade-offs are almost always made in the business's favor. The value system that really rules is the one that relates to corporate performance. One of the many ways that we seek to overcome this in our work at Tethix, in combination with other approaches, of course, is to position ethics as a living process, a dynamic system, if you will. And one of the ways that we do this is by calling on an adaptation of the 4E approach to cognition from the cognitive sciences. This proposes that cognition doesn't exclusively occur up here, but is variously embodied, embedded, enacted, or extended by way of extracranial processes and structures. And thanks to Dr. John Vervaeke at the University of Toronto, we add 2 more E's into the mix: emotional and exapted. Let me just really quickly touch on what we mean. So embodiment, basically cognition involves the biology of the body. Embedded, cognition exists between the organism and its environment. It can't be separated from its environment to some extent. Enactive, thinking doesn't just take place in the head. Extended, cognition is extended through other people, through technologies, etc. Emotional, cognition shouldn't be separated, or at least the way that we tend to think about cognition shouldn't be separated from emotion. And exapted, cognition adapts things. In our experience, this attempt to apply the 6 E's to the process of doing ethics, it can shift ethics away from something that feels boring and potentially burdensome, something, again, that we have to do, towards something that is interesting, that is valuable, and that is potentially even joyful, something that makes us smile. To build on this, I'm going to hand things over to Matt.
Thanks, Nate. And I'll just acknowledge that I'm coming to you in this presentation from Dharawal country in Sydney on the east coast of Australia. So from this 6 E's prism, we can better see ethics as a relational and active participatory decision-making process. It's a living system that harnesses diverse stories that reflect what people within the organization actually care about in the work that they do. The stories from people and communities in which this work actually impacts. And catalyzing a shift in language, mindsets, and behaviors by having this embedded in the everyday rituals, practices, workflows, and tooling that's used to develop AI technologies and emerging technologies. While this scale of participation lends itself more to ethics that is emergent rather than imposed from the top down, as Nathan was talking about earlier, it does need to account for the whole, top down, middle out, and bottom up. So that's the authorizing environment that you might see from senior leadership and management, but also the middle management that's tasked with operationalizing in any formal procedures and processes, but also that which reflects the everyday stories that are enacted in cross-functional product development. So importantly, this all needs to weave together in the interacting and the engagement with stakeholders outside of organizational boundaries, like getting out of the building. These are the hopes, the dreams, and fears of communities and society as a whole. And it needs to also reflect this cultivation of psychological safety. so people can actually speak up when there is a hunch that they might have that something just doesn't necessarily feel right. And this place of deep respect for the ambiguity and not knowing what will emerge in these processes, these participatory ethics processes that are much more uncertain. So participatory experiments need to be practical and enable a learn by doing approach and playing it out before you live out. So simulating those and including co-production techniques, situating these in real world situations as best as possible, simulating those and including the relationships beyond the boundaries of the organization. So we're bringing all this active participation to life in what we're doing with elemental ethics and our work at Tethix. So working from the skills that are already present within organizations and emphasizing a holistic approach to account for it. So one that might be about sitting around the virtual campfire, telling stories of what your purpose, your values, your principles might actually mean in practice, building that shared understanding, that shared context, and that shared orientation of what it all means. Having a digital workplace that has these stories embedded in the artifacts, the tools, the systems used to support a living and breathing embodiment and extension of ethical intentions and action. So this is ETHOS, which stands for the Ethical Tension and Health Operating System. So after 2 years in research and development, we're poised to launch an early version of the Ethical Tension and Health Operating System. So our platform that takes elemental ethics from theory to practice. So we're partnering with 2 major corporations, a startup hub, and a research institution to pilot the first version of the ETHOS platform and continue on this path of co-creation and active participation. So this is ongoing R&D, and really our commitment to trying to learn in the open as best as possible. It's an expression to call on people like yourselves that might be listening to this and those that were participating and contributing to the amazing discussion that we had as part of the Diversity and Inclusion Symposium on AI development at Data 61 CSIRO yesterday. So we need to work together better across disciplines to reimagine and co-create technology that supports human and planetary flourishing. So now we'll dive into some of the questions and maybe the more nuanced discussion that we didn't have an opportunity to because of time constraints yesterday. And I'll just kind of stop sharing my screen now and remove that from our background. And Nathan, I guess there was a few questions that came up that we can probably start with. And one that was quite a big theme in the conversations yesterday, and that was like, how do you motivate, like, what is the motivation for an organization to use these approaches? Like, why should they actually care? You know, given that, you know, business metrics and bottom line business values tend to be the ones that dominate.
So
yeah, it's a tough question, that one.
Yeah. So who are we asking? Are we asking Mark Andreessen, or is it so that's a joke about the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, which we will discuss at a later date. We don't have enough time to get into that right now. Well, so there is lots of different ways that we can look at this. So you described this idea of sort of relationality, which to some extent is a metaphysical position that describes the nature of life as being inherently relational, and that has many different implications. And that has been a very prominent feature of our First Nations peoples here in this country for at least 60 to 70,000 years. But is certainly not exclusive to these lands and these diverse cultures. So that is one way we could look at this. But let me sort of like flip it almost 180 and say, well, let's just say that you are a director of a modern corporation. Therefore, you have a fiduciary responsibility obligation, if you will, to act in the best interest of your shareholders. Ideally considering some other things, but that is really the primary value to which a corporation's performance is benchmarked, measured, etc. The way that I would look at it is by describing, and it would be cool if we had a sort of whiteboard here to play around, but probably the relationship, the multi-level relationship, it's not linear, but we can describe it somewhat linearly just for the purposes of clarifying today, the relationship between doing ethics well and the social license that an organization has to operate. Basically, the phenomenon that describes the organization's ability within a socio-cultural context to do the things that it wants to do. Now, the way that I would describe that very briefly is that ethics is sort of like the bottom of the stack. The process of doing ethics well influences an organization's trustworthiness. Now, there are many different models that we can call upon here, but let's just go with the most simple qualities or characteristics in the literature: benevolence, integrity, and competence/ability, depending on how you want to frame it. So doing the process of ethics well, embodying ethics, enables the organization to design more prominent qualities or features, organizational features of trustworthiness. Those features then interface with people outside of the organization, and they impact trust, the belief that other parties have in the organization's trustworthiness, or the willingness that different folks have to be vulnerable, relationally vulnerable to that organization based on some positive expectation. Trust that, as I've just described, impacts reputation, what people say about the organization, which has lots of different mimetic implications, etc. And both trust and reputation directly seem to impact social license to operate. So you can try and skip straight to how do we enhance our social license to operate? But if you don't do the groundwork, you're going to be caught out. And what I would suggest is that what we are describing enhances the capacity for the organization to do ethics well at every level of this complex adaptive system that is, in fact, the organization or organism itself. And as a result of that, you are increasing your likelihood to have a positive social license to operate, which means that you are afforded more flexibility, which means that people tend to be more forgiving of your genuine mistakes. Guess what? We're all fallible. Stuff happens, right? There are also very strong positive associations between trust, reputation, social license to operate, and traditional markers of corporate performance, including growth and EBITDA. So, you know, you can take that very much embedded in almost seriously like a neoliberal paradigm, and talk about the value, the commercial value that ethics has. Now, that's of course not the only perspective from which we might approach this. But I think it's one that's potentially useful, particularly if you are an organizational decision maker that is wanting to do good, but feeling the many pressures that you necessarily interface with on a daily basis as a result of the value system within which corporations exist.
And a lot to factor in there. And part of one of the key points that was coming up in discussions yesterday, and I think this is a common one, is the organizations that take this stuff seriously, that see, be that the rational economic and business performance argument, that actually taking this stuff seriously, being proactive, engaging in this process to do things well, to follow through on the things that they say they want to stand for, they're the ones that tend to invest in this. Yep. They create the authorizing environment. They devote resources, budget to figure out what is this pathway to maturing, you know, my responsible AI practices in my organization. And similarly, with the organizations that we tend, you know, and the decision makers that we tend to have conversations, they're further on in the journey. They've seen these connections. They see the importance, so that the motivations are generally there. There's a clear incentive, rather than going, okay, well, I'm an organization that's actually gone through some trust breach, ethics breach, or being called out for ethics washing. Holy crap, it's hit our bottom line. Our share price is down. Oh fuck, we got to do something about this. And then, it comes from this reactionary perspective. As much as we'd like to see more organizations being proactive and being motivated because there's a sense of responsibility and fiduciary responsibility and obligation, taking action and taking seriously. It's not always the case. The organizations that want to do this well are unfortunately few and far between. The other thing that comes up here is, and it was part of some of the questions from yesterday, and it was token gestures to co-production and real, meaningful, active participation, both internally within the organization, but also to engage outside perspectives, to go outside of this membrane or, the organizational boundaries. Commonly, we see at least some organizations in the public sector, as an example, are doing co-production, and having, to some degree, legislative force in engaging with communities in which might be impacted by policy decisions or technology. Robo-debt was brought up as a case study yesterday, and that was a classic example of no real engagement with the people that were going to be impacted, just aside from testing of letters to ensure compliance. And that was a bit of a debacle here in Australia that we must ensure that we don't reproduce similar trajectories. So, what, and the question on this is more resourcing, right? Because engaging in diverse deliberative practices, it takes time, it takes effort. There's a huge amount of resources that are required to engage with diverse perspectives. And, an organization like Microsoft, who have extraordinary budgets, can engage in things like community juries and engage those diverse stakeholders, versus like small startups. Like we're a small team, 3-4 people. It's much more resource intensive for us to do it, and we have to take things slow. So how do you overcome some of these tension points in organizations?
Yeah, like it's such a great line of questioning, and I don't think it can be separated from the broader context within which we all relate, coexist, etc. So in an environment that basically encourages corporations to externalize as much as possible, no true cost accounting, shortcuts are actually rewarded. So within that value system, within that accounting system, within that economic framework, this stuff is hard to justify. But let's say we can't change that. Of course we can, because it's a human institution, but let's just say we can't. We have more existential issues to worry about if we can't change that. And they're already here, in fact. But let's just sort of say we can't, for the sake of doing a very brief thought experiment. So what could we still do if we couldn't change some of that bigger stuff? If we couldn't change the way that our activities relate to something bigger, like higher order goal or whatever it may be, bringing life back within planetary boundaries, raising the social ceiling, whatever it may be, right? What are the ways in which we could still value from this by being intelligent about the overall approach? Well, I think there are some interesting ways to look at this. So even if we don't do true cost accounting, we can look at the relationship of what does it mean to develop something that has real qualitative potential relative to something that is just fast to market, right? And there are lots of different ways that we could use fairly traditional approaches to economically justify how to weight those things relative to one another. And I think in many cases, doing something a bit better is likely to be more of an economic advantage, particularly over a slightly longer period of time. Now, if we're only looking at every quarter or even 12 months, it's a little bit tricky, but I don't think, like, there are lots of, like Apple, yeah, I'm not putting them on a pedestal or anything, but they do some stuff really well. One of the things that they do seem to do very well is very long-term strategic thinking. And like, you see this, like all these different movements that they make as an organization. And then a decade later, literally, they release something and you're like, oh, they planned it the whole time, right? So there's some stuff there. We could change the narrow value system that helps us assess what success looks like for a product or service. The other is, instead of having like these very high friction processes, which may be necessary like the first few times you engage in co or participatory design, right? Or co/participatory ethics. And that's probably a good thing. We want to go slow. We want to explore. We want to make mistakes within the safest possible environment. But what if we actually could operationalize that? And here I would call on things like socio-technical architectures for living labs. Like, there's no reason why we can't have like longitudinal participation in all different manner of decision-making, product development context, product refinement context, et cetera, et cetera. So we might start a little bit slow. That's normal, right? In pretty much every context we look at when we're doing something new. And then like we achieve what we tend to value in society, which are all these different efficiency gains. And I would say, instead of just looking at it as an efficiency gain, try and figure out, what does an effectiveness gain look like? Right? It's an important, it's kind of like reframing. It's still like, effectiveness has efficiency baked into it, but it's wider boundaries. So I don't know, those are some ways that I would encourage folks to think about it.
Yeah, and the shift in framing from efficiency to effectiveness is actually a really important distinction to make, an effective in achieving more positive outcomes for both the business and the stakeholders in which that business might impact. I think there's a lot of richness that we can dive into in this conversation. I actually think it's worth us doing a follow-up video as a continuing dialogue around some of these questions that have come up as a result of this kind of presentation that we didn't get an opportunity to now or in the session yesterday. And we'll leave it at that, because I think we both have to pick up our daughters from school. Thank you for listening. We'll do a follow-up video and continue this discussion on figuring out how do we not just collectively make these incremental gains. And I think we do need to, think big and act tiny and do this small stuff, like doing the small participatory engagement and deliberation in an organization outside an organization is better than not at all. But also how that, can compound over time as well. It might be an important thread to continue this conversation with.
Can I just, 1 minute, I know we both got to go, but one thing I would suggest, if you've been interested in this discussion, we've published in the past about the ways that we've evolved consequence scanning. Now, importantly, consequence scanning isn't new in the sort of tech ethics space. It's basically what risk folks have done forever, right? But one of the things that you can do is use the evolved consequence scanning method that we describe and apply it in co and participatory contexts. And what that does is, because you are including diverse, like, you're probably going to do consequence scanning anyway. All you do is invite the most diverse and representative sample of potentially impacted stakeholders that you realistically can into the very same process that the cross-functional team would be running. So there's that open invitation, right? There's a little bit of additional work involved, but really not much. Like, we're talking about marginal costs here. And what that does is it massively diversifies the lenses that are applied to the problem and the opportunity space. So the richness of your consequence scanning and your amplification and mitigation proposals is it's like nth degree better. You know what I mean? It's not like 1 + 1 = 1. It's like, 1 + 1 = 475 type of thing. And that's such an easy thing that you can do just to start with. And maybe for your first project or program or product, you just do it once, right? And that's a really great starting point, a really helpful starting point. And if you want to know more about the specifics of how to do that, please reach out.
Yeah, lots of smaller steps to build on to make this stuff real. And we'll continue this conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.